things that made it appear to be like cricket were eliminated, including first what was called the fair bound rule, which is if you hit the ball and then it dropped, it took one bounce, and you caught it on the one bounce, the fair bound rule would mean you were out. That was quickly eliminated, and then it was followed by what was called foul. The fair foul requirement, which meant that if the ball was hit outside the lines, it was hit in foul territory, let's say you caught it on one bounce, that would be recorded as an out as well. And so, those things made it appear a little bit like, too much like cricket, I think. And that the idea was, those of you who know cricket, if it's played properly, it takes a period of 4 or 5 days, 12-hour days, with a couple of tea breaks and a lunch break as well. And Americans were willing to spend about 2 hours. And in fact, if you're complaining about the length of games now, there is nothing that is being said today that wasn't said back in the 1880s. One person said, "My God, the game started 3 o'clock. They went to 5. Don't they know we have supper to eat?" And that situation was prevalent from its very inception. So the idea of increasing the game, making it quicker, would be to put the importance less on hitting until eventually the rule that the batter could call for where it was, and every pitch had to be either a ball, a strike, or a foul ball, which wasn't considered anything in the very beginning. And they could never get the correct number of balls. It's 4 balls for a walk now. It started out as 9. Okay, and so the idea was, again, that was the last vestiges of, the pitcher has to accommodate the batter. Well, as pitching became more important, a couple of other developments quickly followed. One was that people started wearing gloves. Prior to that time, everything that was played would be played, without baseball gloves. The catcher frequently would have a leather glove with the center cut out of it so that he wouldn't break his fingers. But he generally wouldn't be directly in back of the batter. He'd wait and let it bounce once, and then he would catch it in that regard. So again, all of that gradually moves forward until the magic year of 1887. 1887, in which these following rules called for a different sort of game. That the box was reduced even further. The calling for high and low pitches by the batter was eliminated, and then they put in a home plate. Now, those of you who've played the game know all too well that you slide into home base, and you don't slide very well as a little kid. You're liable to hit your back and get the wind knocked out of you. Anyone who's played for any length of time, male or female, has had that experience of getting the wind knocked out of them as they slide into home because they don't know how to slide properly. And I can still remember the few times it happened to me. Well, imagine what it would be like if home base was marble. And home base started out as marble. And it was only in 1887 that it was changed to some form of rubber, which is close to what it has now. One other thing I have to back up and say is that in 1879, the reserve clause was instituted. Now, the reserve clause is very important to baseball. Baseball is the only business activity in the United States that has a legal right to a monopoly, including every other sport, professional sport, from pro football to tiddlywinks. It had an antitrust exemption because in 1919 there was this infamous Black Sox scandal about gambling. People were worried that baseball was going to disappear. Baseball was the only leisure activity that all levels of society could experience. So in 1922, the Supreme Court made a decision that said the ultimate purpose of baseball is sport and it's not a business. So the antitrust exemption applies to Major League Baseball. And if you wonder why all of the people now who are pursuing the performance-enhancing drugs are really excited about it when they weren't excited about it prior to that particular point, was in those congressional hearings. The senator from New York, the Democratic senator, Schumer, just mentioned to the Bud Selig that maybe it's time that we look into baseball's antitrust exemption, at which point they became fiery in pursuing it. Remember, this was the same group of people who, after the 1994, I'm talking about the owners and management, who essentially winked at people like Mark McGuire and Sammy Sosa and so on. You know, remember there was a campaign, Chicks Dig the Long Ball. You know, the idea was that they were promoting these guys because it was a feel-good story. They're breaking all sorts of records and so on and so forth. Well, Bud Selig became the avenging angel when he heard that the antitrust exemption was being questioned. Okay, what is the reserve clause? The reserve clause, I mean, it's much refined today. We don't need to discuss it, but it still is in existence, which essentially says the person who signs you has control of your career for 6 years in minors and 6 years in majors. The reserve clause originally applied to 5 people, and very soon after 1879, it was 14. And you might say, well, that's okay. You know, the reserve clause meaning that the players who were owned in perpetuity by the ownership. Okay, that's fine. There's no problem. There's no difficulty with that. Except that 14 was a very important number because most of the rosters in the 19th century were 12. If somebody was injured, you might hire a 13th or a 14th person. So it meant that the entire team was essentially, you know, under the reserve clause. And the other thing that's important to know in this story somewhat is that the owners didn't even trust themselves. So what they did is after the reserve clause was instituted in 1879, they instituted, prior to that, a basic agreement which said essentially that we're not going to sign players, you know, from other leagues. And so it's hands off. So they didn't quite trust themselves, but if you signed the basic agreement, that was important. So that these things come up because in 1888, the winter after Bud Fowler's appearance here, the minor leagues adopted a reserve clause. And so from 1888 till 1975, you could argue that baseball controlled its players as indentured servants. You know, if Ted Williams has been frozen, and you know, the great player Ted Williams, he's in a cryogenic holding house for 200 years. And the point I always say to myself is that if Ted Williams in 200 years is unfrozen and he's ready to play baseball again, he will still be a Boston Red Sox unless the Red Sox either release him or they trade him. But he will, Ted Williams is a Boston Red Sox in perpetuity according to the laws of the day. Well, back to New Mexico. There are 2 major influences on baseball, but prior to that, I'd like to have us take a look here at Bud Fowler and to see the only 2 known pictures of him. This is a picture of Fowler that's actually on the cover of my book, and he was 27 years of age, and in the next photo you'll see it a little bit more clearly what the team looked like. Let's see. Oh. Just give me a second, please. Well, anyway, you see him in the second here. And Keokuk's. And he didn't have a very good year that year. I think he batted .222, but he was a favorite and was 27 years old. That's important to realize at this point. So the next photo is 9 years later, and you see him on the right. He's 36 years of age. However, he said he was 45. And that was part of the self-promotion that he went through. The reason he made himself 9 years older was that he wanted to be the grand old man of African-American baseball, what they call colored baseball. And so it would, the level of play that he was still playing at for a 45-year-old would be, off the charts, so to speak. Now, also he had a nemesis in the white world, Adrian Cap-Anson. He was the first person to get 3,000 hits. He was beloved, by everyone. He was the manager of the Chicago White Stockings, who had won 3 or 4 championships. And he was a virulent racist. And it was through Anson's racism, coupled with a couple of other activities in 1887, the year before Fowler made it out here, which kind of led to that particular change, I think, in Fowler. So the first time he was 27. Now 9 years later, he's 45. And that was part of this promotion so that he could in some way, say, well, Cap-Anson is playing at this level, and I'm even older and I'm playing at this level. So it was a form of self-promotion more than anything else. Okay? Now, what follows here is a picture from the photo archives, by the way, of the Silver City, New Mexico stagecoach line in 1889, the year after Fowler was here. That what the railroads did, they came in 1878, I believe, and this information, I'll be responsible for all the errors, but Fred Friedman, who is a train expert and historian here in Santa Fe, helped me with this particular section. That the Atchison's Peak in Santa Fe that entered through the Raton Pass in 1878 ran finally down to Silver City. The tracks, it originally was going to end in Santa Fe, but for reasons of topography, again, the local historian Adrian Bustamante and Kermit Hill helped me with this aspect. Santa Fe is up on a mesa, and the railroad engineers didn't like that. So what they did is they just bypassed Santa Fe originally when they laid the track, and they went from Laing to Albuquerque. Well, Santa Fe, of course, was outraged, and they realized that they were going to become a second-class city, unless they had a spur. So the Atchison's Peak in Santa Fe did some real strong convincing of the local people in Santa Fe to build a spur, and the Laing spur is what you will see in the next picture. It was completed, I believe, in 1880, in the early part of the year. So it was built rather quickly, but it was done under duress by the city fathers here in Santa Fe. And this is a picture of them heading towards Santa Fe. The Atchison's Peak in Santa Fe. Now, the railroads were important in a lot of different ways. They brought Eastern fashion. They brought some settlers. You had the 1862 Homestead Act, in which you were given 160 acres of land that if you lived on it for 5 years, built a house, and raised crops for 5 years, then you could file a deed and that you would own that particular land. The railroads also brought tourists with the the Harvey houses that were built along the way, in which you would get a decent meal and you would get a nice, sweet girl from the Midwest who would be waiting on you and paying attention to you. One of the earliest and most famous of the Harvey houses is La Fonda right here. It was originally a parking house. And Fred Harvey also tried to sell and market Santa Fe in the following way. He thought it was exotic, and so he tried to sell Native American culture in that regard, and he thought it was a very good health spot, and so he tried to sell it. So when people say, why did you move to Santa Fe? And you say, because of the weather and the tripartite culture, that was being done in the 1880s as well. It was the same sort of marketing that was being done. Now, besides all of this, the railroads were bringing consumer goods and heavy machinery, and what they brought were people from outside the territory itself. And it was important because New Mexico as a territory, I think, was the territory the longest before it moved from being a territory into statehood. And part of the reason was New Mexico was sparsely populated, its mineral resources were varied but not very exotic. Quite honestly, the Easterners who were appointed to be politicians viewed there was too much Spanish speaking. You had Mexican natives who were living here. Remember, they were the enemy in the 1846 war with Mexico. So it was a dangerous, exotic place, and much of the rest of the Union had to be convinced that New Mexico was part of the Union. And another local historian mentioned to me, it got so bad, this Americanization policy versus traditionalism, that, and Kermit, you can help me with this. I think it was in the 1870s or the early 1880s, that all of the portals on the Santa Fe Plaza were taken down because they wanted to be like Topeka. Topeka was the view of what a state capital was. And since the Santa Fe Trail, the goods came from Fort Leavenworth, there was always a Kansas connection. And so that, worked for a couple of years until people said, well, if we're trying to sell this as an exotic place, why are we trying to look like Topeka? And so they just put up the portals again, a few years after that. They also wanted to build a three-story office building in the middle of the plaza, again, so that it would dominate the plaza. Before the gazebo, there was what was called the Santa Fe Pagoda, and there'll be a picture of that fairly soon coming up. But the railroads were influential, but they weren't a dominant force, because you had three economic depressions that occurred in the 19th century, one from 1873 to 1878, which would be following upon, the introduction of the railroads here, and then there was a huge one in 1893 to 1898, I believe, approximately, and that was the great bank panic that occurred, and so the railroads ran into difficulties with financing and funding, and so they were a great promise, the railroads, but they really didn't bring economic prosperity and increased population, which is what the territory wanted, so they could say, look at us, we are part and we're welcome to the rest of the country. A second outside influence was the importance of the military, that baseball itself was part of the physical culture curriculum of the Army. It was cheap, and you could get a lot of people involved. And while the Civil War limited the number of teams and leagues playing in the East and the Midwest, because of the war itself, it helped spread the game further westward and southward during that particular time. And so that was an influence. Jackie, could you put the next photo? And there you see the regiment, and in the background they're playing baseball. Okay. I think that was 1862 or so. The key element in New Mexico was the influence, which far outstripped their numbers, of the Buffalo Soldiers. The Buffalo Soldiers were the African Americans who were allowed to enter, to join the Army in 1866. They were given $13 a month, a uniform, and housing and lodging, and they were expected to do a number of activities, including the following. And they were sent to New Mexico, the New Mexico-Arizona border, because it was the most dangerous place in America. They were felt so that you would send those there. Those quote-unquote those people there to deal with the situation. They patrolled the Mexican border. They fought the Indian Wars, which really didn't end until 1886 with the capture of Geronimo and Skeleton Canyon, Arizona. They policed the railroads that were running. Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. They were the equivalent of military police. What would take 2 months before going over the old Santa Fe Trail now took more like 3 days, 4 days, something like that. And that they also did civil work, and this was important because they went out into the community to do this. They did exploring, mapping, road building. They strung telegraph lines, and not only that, as a community outreach, they helped spread the gospel of baseball, as well as being wonderful advocates of music and bands. In fact, they were hired by, if you had a wedding in Santa Fe at the time, you would hire the Ninth Cavalry Orchestra to play, at your wedding. So the next set of pictures are about the Buffalo Soldiers. The people on the poles, I always wondered why flag sitting was such a big aspect of the late 19th, early 20th century. Those are scouts who are up on top of the poles looking out. And this is kind of the type of camp that they were dealing with. Okay. The next one, they're in full dress uniform. Okay. The next one, this is the Santa Fe Plaza Pagoda, and they're all African Americans who are playing, very likely on a military occasion, especially 4th of July. They're very popular for 4th of July activities. Okay. All right, and then this is the same year as what Fowler integrates the professional league. You have African American players, mixed race players, and then you've got the 2 white captains or coaches or whatever they served at the particular time. Okay? Baseball also in Santa Fe, in the area, became a civic competition. It was this sense of belonging and place and a fight for economic survival. You had a lot of young males. You had leisure time. You had money. You had women, and you had gambling. And so it was a fairly wide open place at the particular time, and whoever had the best baseball team would be, a kind of sense of one upmanship of the entire league. The league was connected by the rail lines. So you had Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and Las Vegas. They all played El Paso, which was also on the lines. And they played other teams as well. There were teams, more amateur teams from Socorro, Madrid, Raton, Fort Selden, Fort Bayard, just about every fort that they didn't turn around and close down, because that was part of their responsibility as well for those soldiers, was to close redundant forts, sort of clean up the vestiges of the Civil War, the Indian Wars, and the Mexican Wars. That's essentially was their assignment. Okay? Santa Fe itself had a particular history of this. They were the 4-time declared state champion Now, who they played and how many teams they beat, or whether it was simply bragging on their part because they didn't have any legitimate rival prior to that, they were considered to be the reigning amateur champions. And that baseball was actually part of the Santa Fe Public Schools curriculum. Again, for the same reason it was popular in the Army, you could get a lot of people together, you needed bat and ball and field, and you could play boys and girls together, it didn't matter. You know, the schools themselves were not that very big, and it was part of that whole 1880s movement of personal cleanliness and health and, you know, strong body, strong mind, that sort of thing. And it was prominently displayed in the January 1st newspapers that this is going to be part of the curriculum. And also you had the Santa Fe Indian School, which had a double-edged response to baseball. And they were great baseball players, and they did play, at least on the what they called the kid level, on the middle school and high school level, they would play Anglo teams. Was that, you know, for the Anglo teachers of the Native Americans, it was a view of Americanization. We want to show you our culture. You know, our culture is the one that you need to respond to. And the Native Americans internalized it and said, listen, if we can beat them at their own game, you know, and then the sort of competitive nature of it, and they became very, very good baseball players. And if you know, in the years that followed, it's, you know, outside of running, has had the longest tradition of sports in the Pueblos themselves. So, you know, you have that tradition as well. Well, with all this being said, I thought it would be good also to read one quotation that talked about the physical and sensual nature of baseball itself. This is, I'm quoting from the time. The pull of baseball's aesthetic qualities was very strong. It was a game of beauty and finesse. The rhythmic swing of the batter, the smooth delivery of the pitcher, the quick stop, an acrobatic throw of an infielder, the grace and speed of an outfielder racing and then circling under a high fly ball, contemplating its graceful part in the sunshine. These could delight the eye of even the uninitiated. The other senses were also satisfied by the crack of the bat, the smack of the horsehide against the leather glove, the cries of the hawkers in the stands, the roar of the crowd, and the smell of cigars, peanuts, and hot dogs. And then there was the emotional appeal stemming from the suspense of many small crises, the stirring of hope, sometimes fulfilled or sometimes dashed, in the excitement from the rapid change from apparent defeat to unexpected victory, the security and thrill of being a part of a large crowd, the chance to let loose at the umpire of the opposing team. In short, all the vicarious atavistic satisfactions of combat, even though it be in the form of a sham battle between two groups of paid performers. So just the game itself was attractive. So, Jackie, if we could see the next group of photos. Jake Gold, this is at the corner of Burrough Alley and San Francisco Street. The Lensic would be just a few doors down. Jake Gold was an entrepreneur from the East who came out here and made his killing. He was one of the chief supporters of the Santa Fe Angels, financial supporters of it. The next one is his lumber yard in 1888, the actual year. And there's the Santa Fe Indian School in the 1880s. Gives you a sense of all those trees that are now gone. Yeah. In that regard. Okay, the next one. This is looking from Fort Marcy down into the town. And where the Santa Fe Angels play, I'm not absolutely certain. I think it's in the rail yard closest to Paseo de Peralta and Guadalupe Street, you know, where the big, those big sculptures are at the present time. Because it had a fence, and that was a very important aspect. But these places didn't have fences, but this would be a perfect place for the soldiers to play baseball, field football. Okay, the next one. These are some local teams. This is the 1888 St. Michael's college team, which would be middle school team. Notice the bats And notice he's got the catcher second from the right. He's got a little glove. You know, that was his catcher's mitt, and then he's got a mask, but everyone else doesn't have a glove. Okay. Now the next picture is of the 1904 Santa Fe Mechanics. They were a mixed race group, and notice that all of the players had gloves by this particular time, and that you see the management in the back, you know, holding on to, it looks like a scorebook. In statistics, one aspect of the popularity of baseball is people have always been trying to quantify it, you know, with batting averages, and Bill James has made a career out of creating new categories of statistics. And, you know, from its inception, that was the case. The next one is the 1909 New Mexico Normal, or Highland University, that morphed into Highland University. And notice it has a student manager in this particular situation. And a personal, I found this in Donnelly Library in back of a file cabinet that looked like it hadn't been moved in 100 years. And just was snooping around. I had an English 101 class and I was bored with the library tour. So I just kind of went off by myself and found this photograph, and that they were able to trace it back to 1909. And finally, this is the Cloudcroft Schoolboy Native American. And this was a gift from local historian Kermit Hill. And it shows in 1911, you know, they didn't have uniforms, they had gloves, they had bats, they had a manager. And so that, and you know, I think there's one more picture I want to show. This is the only action shot I could find of baseball. It's one of the very few, I think, that are in existence. Because of the shutter speed that you couldn't get, you know, photographs like this. But it's a person who's running towards first base. And it's just a bunch of guys hanging out and playing baseball. I don't know where it was from, but it was, it's from a collection of a private collection in Socorro. But, you know, this is Santa Fe. Okay? And then finally, this is the Las Vegas team. They were the stars of the New Mexico Baseball League of 1888, and that they were the team that ultimately Santa Fe had to beat if they were going to win the championship. Okay? Okay. So, Jackie, could you go back to 2? And so we'll just keep on following up. I have 1 or 2 very, very last slides. Santa Fe agents came out of the gate incredibly well. They played a number of games against Las Vegas. They won the games. The Arizona State Championships came to Santa Fe to visit. They were from Tombstone, Arizona. That was they were the reigning champions, and they had a great pitcher named Hapwell. Now, what happened right after this great start by Santa Fe was that the league went into hysterics because of Hapwell. Everyone wanted to sign Hapwell, even though he lost 3 games to the Santa Fe agents. It was clear that he was a great pitcher, and everyone was looking for a great pitcher. And the pitcher would pitch the entire game, the entire season. In fact, in the National League in 1876, the championship, I think it was the Boston Red Sox, had a person who pitched 573 innings, which was the exact number of innings that the team played. So there were no substitutes. You went in and you took your licks and you did what you could in that regard. Hapwell comes along, and because, and this goes back to that basic agreement, because Santa Fe was a non-signatory of the basic agreement, it meant that they felt they could sign any player from any contract outside of their own league. So every player that I could find out any information about in the New Mexico Baseball League of 1888 was a ringer. That there were no locals who actually played on the team itself. They were hired guns brought in by the civic leaders, you know, as a promotional tool, as a publicity tool, you know, to build local spirit in that regard. So I'd like to just read a bit about the Hapwell imbroglio, because it led to, since it was kind of free rein on signing people, and they were non-signatory, Hapwell was a person who had a very, very poor reputation. I'll try to go through this as quickly as I can. By the way, it's already 12:45 if you want, anyone needs to leave because of lunch or whatever. If you want to hang in there, I'd love to have you stay, but I understand that. First of all, Hapwell was a pitcher for the touring Tombstone team that Santa Fe trounced in May. Now, the ancient city outfielder O'Neill spoke to Hapman about playing for Santa Fe, so he tampered with the other team's player. Santa Fe manager Preston offered Hapman $5 more a month to play for the Ancients. Hapman asked for and received permission to play for his old Tombstone team for one last game in Las Vegas before reporting to Albuquerque to play against Albuquerque for Santa Fe on May 30th. Hapman received a $7 advance from the Santa Fe for expenses to go by train from Santa Fe to Las Vegas. None of that is in dispute. What happened to Hapman when he was in Las Vegas is in dispute, but he was a heavy drinker. And Hapman signed another contract to play for Las Vegas and went to the Duke City with his even newer teammates. Okay, so he just said, pocketed the money, the expense money, and got a better offer. It goes on. The Albuquerque manager Crawford was warned that he'd be fined $100 under the New Mexico baseball bylaws if Hapman took the field against Las Vegas. So Las Vegas and Albuquerque did play a game that day, but they called it an exhibition. And that Las Vegas eventually withdrew its claims on Hapman. Now the Albuquerque and Santa Fe newspapers had a heyday. They went berserk. The Albuquerque Daily Citizen said of his conduct in Sunday's game, Hapman, the blacklisted player, is the most disagreeable player in New Mexico. He has associated himself with 8 gentlemen of the Las Vegas club in his presence among them, almost disgraces the whole 9 in the eyes of respectable people. Pennant, besides being blacklisted in New Mexico, is a Californian who's been blacklisted there for throwing games. He is crooked in every sense of the word. The 6th inning was remarkable for the kicking of Pennant, that is complaining, arguing with the umpire. And the air around the pitcher's box was blue from his profanity. It hurts him to have his great curve caught on by the home team. So we know we're there at the Legion's level. Well, this is the result of what happened to all of this. And again, I have to read this because I can't keep it all straight. Hapman was not drunk when he signed the Santa Fe contract. That was the response. Since the New Mexico Baseball League does not recognize contract outside its own, Hapman was free to sign with Santa Fe. Santa Fe did not delay in informing Las Vegas of their official blackballing of Hapman. Well, actually, the notice dates did slip by, but it was only a minor infraction by assistant manager Ward. And Albuquerque would refuse to play Las Vegas on June 9 and 10 if Hapman plays. The whole league shut down for a period of about a month. Everyone got angry and went off and went in their different directions at that particular time. During that time, Santa Fe was, still looking for a great pitcher, and Albuquerque and more especially Las Vegas were out hustling and getting new players, and getting even better players. So they brought even more ringers in. And so when the season took up again, after about a 4 or 5 week hiatus, Santa Fe found itself on the bottom of the standings because they were playing against players of much higher quality. It was the old question of like saying, I think it was Leo DeRocher said, is that team still in the league? Well, there were questions about, is Santa Fe, still in the league because it's getting trounced by all of these players. Then things turned around. In early July of that year, Bud Fowler, African American, was playing his 5th year of integrated white baseball. And he was playing in Indiana. And it started out that he was signed sight unseen by Lafayette, Indiana. He got there and they said, "Oh, you're black." And actually they said, "Oh, you're colored." And he said, he got angry and said, "Listen, I've had to put up with so much nonsense." The year before, he took the high road in 1887 when he was playing for Binghamton, this far from the major leagues. It would be like, as I said, like playing for Albuquerque Isotopes, and if you had a good season, you'd go up to the majors. Well, what happened there was he took the way out. He must have gotten paid off because he left quietly. And he went up to Montpelier and he became the first co-captain of an integrated white team. And there was no problem. It was fewer than 200 miles away from Binghamton, but it was at a lower league, a lower classification. They loved him. Being a co-captain meant you were manager. You devised the lineup. You coached them. You gave certain strategy sessions and so on and so forth. So all of that, I think, is important to know that 1887 wasn't a complete wash-up for him. But 6 weeks after he left Binghamton, they had investigative reporters there, and it was found out that his white teammates had threatened to boycott the rest of the season. The management wasn't doing very well in Binghamton, so they did what? They just caved to the demands of the white players. And they were all fined $50, which was an enormous amount of money at the particular time. And we know that it wasn't necessarily racism, it was just the fact that he was so clearly the star of the team. Because some of the people who were part of it, who were ringleaders of this 1887 revolt, quiet revolt that eventually came to life, wound up playing with African American players the next year. But they weren't playing at the same position that Bud Fowler was, and they weren't quite as good as Bud Fowler, so they didn't feel threatened by that. So, you had institutional racism, you had the virulent personal racism of somebody like Anson, and then you had this kind of financial fears, and that I think was a significant aspect of the entire situation. So he finds himself in early Indiana. By the way, after he left Indiana, he just went to a smaller town that embraced him. They loved him. He became a player for Crawfordsville. And then Crawfordsville, again, because of the financial precariousness of being part of the minor leagues at that time, became Terre Haute, and then the whole league, the Central Interstate League, shut down. And he had a very good year, but he was looking for a job. It was early July. And he had played out here for a period of five games. In 1885, he played with the Pueblo Blues, which were part of a mining league that had Denver, Pueblo, and Leadville. It was the Colorado State League. Well, he got out there for 5 games, did pretty well, and it came about that the white players complained that they were playing a black person because he was coming in and taking their friends' jobs, and so on and so forth. So what he did was he left and but he had some experience. Actually, he didn't leave and go back east immediately. After the season, he ended the season early. He went to Denver, and he was a barber in his off months. He just couldn't support himself in the baseball center, and so he went there and worked in a barber shop, and he did competitive race walking and race exhibition. He was very, very fast, running exhibitions. So, he knew the area well, and so someone that he had played with said, "Hey, listen, Santa Fe's in desperate, dire need." So he and 2 or 3 other players from that folded league wound up coming out here, and he was signed. And there was no hesitation, no question about his color at all, until the very first road trip that he took which was to Las Vegas. And this is, let me see exactly where this is. The age where the bifocals, I think, need to be trifocals. He did an interview from Las Vegas with a Santa Fe reporter, and it was over being refused permission at the Plaza Hotel in Las Vegas to sit and eat at the community table. And this is his response. Now, remember, just 18 months prior to this, he was taking the high road. Well, you know, you compound that with his experience in Indiana, and then he comes out here, and he clearly was the class not only of the Santa Fe Ancients, but of the league. He had a 343, and as I said, led him to the only professional championship that Santa Fe has ever had. This is the interview that he gave. I came to the territory, I wish to explain to those who visit the games, you know, and it's crossed out, so it looks like I came to the territory willingly or knowingly. Before coming here, I was aware of the fact that a prejudice existed among the players. We are, as a color, and represented in all national sports throughout the United States, and why should we be objected to in baseball? Do we not respect the national game? We're drawing cards and add to the receipts of the game wherever we play. If those who control our clubs would have first-class players at once and not get cast-offs, the good players would hold their positions and not be released on the slightest occasion. Colored players would be retained and there would be no chance for prejudice. We would have better games, better attendance, and the game would be properly supported and made a success. And he ends the interview quite personally. There are several players in the New Mexico League that I have played with in other leagues, and I would like to hear any one of those players speak his opinion and say if he has not found me a gentleman and a hard player. So he's become radicalized in 18 months, you know, after his experience. So back to the playing field, everything goes swimmingly. They finally find a great pitcher from San Francisco, Frank Fudger. And Frank Fudger comes out and is the dominant pitcher they're looking for. Fowler continues. He continues, to play well. One game he had 2 doubles, 2 triples, and a single. Okay, and he was a dominant fielder, and he was mentioned most frequently for his quickness in the field and his base running ability. He was clearly the class of the league in that regard. Now, what then happens is a kind of series of bombshells in the last weeks of the season, and that what occurs is something you could win a cup of coffee, saying, how did Santa Fe win its only professional championship by having the worst winning percentage in the league and not having a playoff? Anyone have any idea? It's the perfect way for Santa Fe to win its only championship. Really? Okay. No tries? Okay. I'll be quick about this. The Las Vegas club, for want of proper support, meaning financial support, disbanded 3 weeks ago when it was leading in the race, thus abandoning the field to its 2 competitors. Now, Albuquerque has gone under. The principal reasons for the disbanding of this club, as near as can be ascertained, was too much boozing on the part of the players, causing a lack of their interest in their behalf on the part of its citizens. Thus, Santa Fe, which did not stand the ghost of a show before, stands alone on the diamond, claims the coveted bunting with no one to oppose her, although, with the aid of some ex-Las Vegas men, they have been playing good ball lately. So as soon as Las Vegas, folded, they went and got their best players and hired them to play in the supposed final series. So they won the pennant because they're the only one left standing. And he was quite popular, and again, to show the difference in various parts of the country, he had a barbershop, as I said. I think it was, like, remember where Dressman's used to be? Frankie Dressman was a student of mine many years ago. And where Dressman's was on the plaza next to the First National Bank, there was a hotel there, okay? You know, where the bank was, called the Capitol Hotel, and this little hole-in-the-wall barbershop. And this is, he bought into that and became an actual partner with an Italian. And this is what the newspaper did to encourage its people to support him. This is from the Santa Fe Herald in September of that year. Second baseman Fowler, he of the Santa Fe team, whom everyone delights to see play ball, is going to settle down as a permanent resident of Santa Fe. Yesterday, he and Barber Haskins formed a partnership and bought out Johnny O'Leary's Capitol Barbershop. Fowler is said to be as handy with the blade, clippers, and shears as he is with the ball and bat. He is a clever fellow all around and deserves success in your support. That's atypical for communities at that particular time, especially for a community in a territory that was looking to be American, you know, in that regard. So I always felt that was fine. At the end of the season, Bud Fowler, I think, quite honestly, sort of gave up on integrated baseball. He did play in 1892 and then 1895 after he had created the most famous black touring team. He invented black touring baseball. He was the first organizer of the Page Fence Giants in 1895, and they were wildly successful. They traveled around the country, you know, in their own railroad car. They would come out in tuxedos. They would drive bicycles because cycling was a real craze then around town, and they would be doing it. They would play to the level of the competition. Many of the tricks that you see the Harlem Globetrotters do today, with you know, the umpire baiting and things like that, are direct, I repeat, are direct steals from Bud Fowler when he was playing against a team that was not very good, and so he could play down to their level. He was smart enough, though, as an African American, to inquire beforehand, you know, the level of competition, and would they be offended if we played this way? And if they would be offended and they wanted to play hardball, then he would just go out and tell his players to murder them. That would be the case, and they would get out of town quickly. But his impact is really phenomenal in that regard. And at the end of, beginning actually in 1889, at the end of 1888, there was an all-star team that was going to be going out to California to play games there. And he was the starting shortstop on this All-American, All-New Mexico team. They had beautiful red, maroon, gold uniforms, you know, red and yellow, the color of New Mexico. They were funded by Duncan, the builder, who built the Las Vegas Opera House. You know, same Duncan was going to support them. They went out there, and no word was ever heard. And he eventually wound up playing for, you know, an all-black team in California. Came back through Galveston, Texas, coached another team, you know, like through spring training, and then went back to the Midwest. But he was a different person at this point. He was a self-promoter, and he saw the handwriting on the wall before many people, not only African American descent, but of Anglo descent as well. And that he became the person that he is today. Now, the influence of him on New Mexico, and this is how I'd like to wrap this up. Jackie, if you could put it on slide 22. It's a quote from the Santa Fe Daily Herald, right before the end of the season, not quite the end of the season. And can all of you read this? Because I hate reading stuff that people can, or do you want me to read it aloud as well?
He didn't mind.
Oh, I will, okay. There were also the never-failing exhibitions of noble baseball game. Compared with the Olympic Games of the Greeks or the bullfights of the Spaniards, were and are as nothing. The remarkable physical development and refinement in ethnic culture of the present American generation are, in my opinion, due to the baseball game. Baseball was two words until primarily the Black Sox scandal. You know, it was base, because it was originally called base, and then it was baseball. So that's why you see it in two ways. When the baseball matches once cease and the small little girl no longer stops you on the street to ask you who has won, then shall the eagle scream as last scream in American Liberty Fair. The development and progress of New Mexico seems to be intimately interwoven with the grand, the noble game of baseball. At least I have heard baseball discussed far more earnestly and frequently by old and young in New Mexico this summer than mining, grazing, farming, or even politics, from which I have inferred that the game of baseball must be important than any of these great interests, or probably than all of them put together. And that was the influence of baseball that Fowler managed to communicate. And then finally, the influence on New Mexico itself, I think is important to note. And again, this will begin, I promise. And it's the last paragraph. In the larger picture of what constitutes the American experience, Bud Fowler's baseball career was both triumph and tragedy. His professional involvement in 19th century baseball tracked the rise and fall of the treatment of African Americans within Americans' national pastime. At the near midpoint of his career, Fowler played a significant role in modeling those national character traits: perseverance, industry, individual initiative, independence, and courage that the New Mexico territory so needed to demonstrate in its process of Americanization in pursuit of statehood, while he helped further popularize and improve the level of professional baseball in New Mexico. His competitiveness and pursuit of excellence in the face of near impossible odds, in his innate dignity and decency in doing so, are his chief contributions to the sport to which he dedicated his life. While his idealistic embrace of the myth of the West as a meritocracy and land of equal opportunity may have been misplaced in an age of social unrest and change, his desire to pursue such a myth throughout his baseball career is a definition and validation of his greatness. And he has earned a place, in a prominent place in the Baseball Hall of Fame. And I would love to live to see the day that he walks in the front door of his hometown, which is he was raised in Cooperstown. So, yeah, 3 blocks below, or if any of you have visited there, 3 blocks below on Main Street, his father, right almost directly across from Doubleday Field, had a barber shop. And he actually went and played on the field that Abner Doubleday supposedly invented the sport. Now, Abner Doubleday didn't invent the sport, but Bud Fowler hung on to that myth because he would have been the only player, white or black, ever to play professionally who played at the Cooperstown Seminary, where baseball was supposed to be. Thank you for your attention. My book is available in the Palace of the Governor's Bookstore, and I will be having an actual official book launch of the book in New Mexico on September 12th at Clay. So there should be copies there. And also in October, I'll be speaking at the Santa Fe chapter of the NAACP.